welcome to another Justin's Morning Coffee. Good morning to you. Okay, so we talked about my four spiritual genres last time, and that was from my book here, Testimony, Celebration, Lament, and Confession. And today I want to talk a little bit about documentary film and symbolism. So one of the main debates that you'll find when it comes to documentary film, and when it comes to any representational or art form that documents, so this bleeds over a little bit into journalism, but also you find it in painting, you find it in photography, and that's this debate over truth and facts. And I think it's very kind of poignant that truth and facts is something of concern to a lot of people in our culture right now. So I want to talk a little bit about how some of that stuff plays out in the world of, again, this applies to a lot of things, but my particular lens is documentary film because that's what I study, and that's what how I've been sort of approaching these things. To kind of get us started on a discussion, I'm going to play a little bit of interview material here for some filmmakers that are themselves kind of wrestling with this the idea of truth and facts.
I tell the story in a way where I'm searching for, not for just the facts. I'm into something which gives you deeper insight into an essence, into a concentration of something that is way beyond facts, and that is truth, as an ecstasy of truth, as I sometimes call it. Otherwise, facts are not that interesting. If you want to have facts, go and buy yourself the phone directory of Manhattan. You've got 8 million entries, and they're all correct. They're all facts, but they do not constitute anything.
With a documentary, there's an agreement with the audience that you are referencing or giving an account of evidence-based reality, that you are actually saying, this is the way the world is as I see it. And that has very little to do with whether you use actors or recreations or anything, really, except that there's an agreement that this is an account of reality. People have a sense when that is violated. I just discovered that Werner Herzog, when he did Little Dieter Needs to Fly, he had this scene where Dieter comes home to his house in California, and he opens and closes the door several times. Because he was a prisoner in Laos, he can't feel shut in. So he opens and closes the door quickly to make sure it's unlocked. And it's a very powerful moment, and I always remember it in the film. Total bullshit. Herzog made that up and made him do it. And it is a wonderful dramatization of the guy's theme. But I think that's a lie.
Look at Michael Moore. He makes pamphlets, basically. He makes polemical films where he carefully constructs a reality to serve his needs. And he's blatant about it, and he's careful in checking his facts. But when you see his film, which are hugely popular and have done a great deal for us documentarians, but he commits, some people would say, crimes towards the art form of documentary.
It is all manipulation. I mean, let's not be too sort of saintly about this. I think filmmaking and documentary making is a very subjective process. And anybody who tries to present themselves as telling the truth in some way is perpetrating a fraud, because it's just impossible.
This idea that there is no such thing as absolute truth, that truth is subjective, there's truth for you, there's truth for me, everybody has their own truth. For me, that's nonsense talk. There's a real world We inhabit that real world. Things happen. Someone sits in the driver's seat of that car and pulls the trigger. That's not up for grabs. There's not this guy's truth and that guy's truth. There's the truth of what actually happened that night.
When you see a film and you have good reason to think that it's the truth, then your knowledge of the real world has been increased. And it's so important for us to really know what's going on.
You do have to be respectful of the facts. Yeah, you should let the facts get in the way of a good story. You absolutely should. And out of that will emerge a true story.
I read this book. It's about two men on a mountain. And I said, this is such a wonderful subject for a documentary, but how the hell do you do it? You couldn't make that story as a fiction film either. And people have been trying for many years, and Tom Cruise, for instance, had the rights, and lots of different people had the rights, and nobody had managed to make a fiction film out of it because, again, it's all internal. And documentary is wonderful for the internal because, you know, people love to talk in a documentary. So I thought, well, the only way to do this is to combine some elements of drama with elements of documentary. But I was so nervous about doing that. That was the real challenge. How do you get reconstruction that really matches up to reality, especially matches up to this extraordinary story?
Came flooding down my thigh, and my knee was very, very, very painful.
The reenactment is not reenacting anything. It's there to make you think about reality, about what we take to be reality, what we think is reality, what claims to be reality.
Because the whole time we're screwing around and not doing a damn job, Americans are dying.
Standard operating procedure is a movie with 3 ingredients. One of them is interviews with real people. The second ingredient is the photographs. The photographs that were taken at Abu Ghraib in the fall of 2003. And the third element is reenacted material, bits and pieces, detail. I like going after odd details.
On his fingers. And he was told he would be electrocuted if he fell off.
And those are constructed. But underneath all of it is this pursuit of some truth.
In the wrong hands, that's quite dangerous, which is when you recreate. With real people who come with all that sort of extraordinary behaviour when people have been in a situation. They know how to behave. And, I mean, I think Battle for Haditha is absolutely brilliant. And I think, thank God, it's Nick doing it, because as a technique, it's quite dangerous to recreate reality because it's so seductive. You really, truly believe that is what happened. If reality programmes are borrowing the sexy packaging of fiction, and fiction is borrowing the immediacy and excitement of documentary, and news, as we know, I don't know where that's going, then it's so confusing for people to know what is or isn't truthful in the end, and what is whose view, and what actually happened or didn't. And I just think it's something we should be careful of and just sort of speak more about the fact that there is this real crossover.
C'est une page de Edgar Morin, le co-réalisateur de Chronique d'un été. Il dit « Nous devons le savoir, le cinéma de fiction est dans son principe beaucoup moins illusoire et beaucoup moins menteur que le cinéma dit documentaire. Parce que l'auteur et le spectateur savent qu'il est fiction. C'est-à-dire qu'il porte sa vérité dans son imaginaire. Par contre, le cinéma documentaire camoufle sa fiction et son imaginaire derrière l'image reflet du réel.
For me, the distinction between feature films, I mean narrative feature films, and documentaries doesn't exist that much. For me, it's all movies. And the borderline is quite often blurred. In documentaries, I keep inventing, I keep using my fantasy, I invent dreams.
So why am I showing you these interview footage of documentarians wrestling with truth and facts? So on the one hand, you can tell that it's not exactly clear what the difference between the truth is and what a fact is. There's more than one filmmaker, interestingly enough, was making kind of that distinction. But let me bring you back to what Werner Herzog said. If you want facts, then you can look in the phone book and you'll have thousands and thousands of facts, and they're all true. They're all true, but they don't mean anything, right? So what's the difference between truth and facts? It just might be the presence of relevance, of meaning, right? This is the fact that is important for what? For whatever it is that I'm doing, or for whatever it is that I'm interested in, right? All of those people in the phone book, they're not relevant to anything that I'm doing or that I'm interested in or that I care about, right? So when you're talking about an art form that's dealing in facts, which documentary film is, which photography is, which I don't know if you consider journalism an art, you might, but dealing in facts, right? It's not enough. A fact in itself is not enough for it to be interesting, useful, relevant, right? So the process of interpretation, the process of framing, the process of choosing what you're going to show, all of that is more of an exercise in figuring out what is meaningful than it is in just the truth. So that's why I think when these filmmakers are talking about truth with a capital T, when Werner Herzog is talking what he calls ecstatic truth, there's this other level of truth, which is maybe factual, but also something else. Okay, so that's one aspect of it. Now, another aspect of it is there's a sense that something that is emblematic is truthful even when it's not factual. So that's a tough one for people. But the best way that I can kind of illustrate it is with an example. First, there's, of course, the example in the Werner Herzog film discussed in this clip, right? Where in Little Dieter Needs to Fly, which is a documentary that Werner Herzog did about a prisoner of war in Vietnam. He inserts reenactment, right, of a anecdote. And this anecdote is not true in the sense that he doesn't do that. He's opening and closing the door to prove to himself that he's not shut in because he was locked up for so many years. So it's emblematic of a certain state of mind. Now, the state of mind in Dieter, the subject of the documentary, is true, right? But the anecdote is not true. But the anecdote points to a larger truth, right? So there's a sense that you could say that the anecdote doesn't need to be factual, right? It only needs to point to something bigger, right? So then when you go on again and you're hearing Errol Morris is the one in the white shirt. I talked a little bit about him in some of my other videos. He's a master at interview documentaries, and he puts in reenactments. Okay, now his approach with reenactments is to find details that you might not think about. So he's in this particular example, this is an execution chamber or a torture chamber, and there's little details of what might be in that prison in Abu Ghraib, right? Or in The Thin Blue Line. This is a movie that he made about a murder, and it wound up that there was someone that was falsely accused, and the witnesses to this murder, the people that fingered basically in court the person who was falsely accused, he reenacted what they would have seen. So he showed sort of how dark it was that night when the police car pulled over this car, and then that policeman was eventually murdered, right? He showed how far away you'd have to be in order to recognize someone's face. He showed all of these different things that would make you think, yeah, you know what? It might be, they might not be right about that. Those eyewitnesses couldn't have known for sure that it was that person, right? So the reenactment is not true. Like it's super stylized and slow motion, and the policeman is drinking a slushy, and then they get shot, and it flies up in slow motion, and it cinematically falls down, and there's close-ups of the gun going off in slow motion. It's very cinematic, and you would say, well, that's not true, right? That's not exactly how it happened. Didn't happen in slow motion. It wasn't all lit, stylized that with fog in the background and everything. But it's there to remind you about certain details in the past that you need to think about. So is that true? It's true, right? It's true in the sense that it's pointing to something that's real, in the thin blue line. The idea that someone probably couldn't recognize another person's face in the dark night like that, that's true, right? So now you start to see, okay, well, there's more going on to truth than just facts. Sometimes something can be truthful but not factual. I know that sounds crazy. And sometimes something can be factual but not truthful. But there's always this kind of relationship between them. And the reason for that is because, like Errol Morris said toward the end of the clip, there's the truth of what happened that night. There is something real, a real reality that exists out there, but we grab onto it in different ways. So in memory, think about memory. When I remember something, weirdly enough, over time, your memory can change. It's a real memory, but it can change. Oftentimes we attach our memories to a photograph. And what happens is in your brain, apparently, it gets rewritten. So the memory writes over itself, almost like a hard drive, like writing over the file. And over time, it can change so that someone can have a real memory and say, when in 1975, when we were at that party, I went into the bathroom. And then that's a real memory in their head, right? And then the other person says, well, that's not how I remembered it at all. In my memory, and their memory is real too, you went into the kitchen, right? And then there's, of course, the truth of what actually happened that night. But one of your memories has to be wrong, right? So, but it's a real memory. So there's this sense that we change reality in the past according to what we need to know, according to what is useful for us. Here's another kind of trivial example, but when I remember a conversation I had with you, let's say over coffee in a busy coffee shop, I'm not going to be remembering the fact that I was annoyed by the music, or that there was somebody talking really loud to me over here, or the fact that I was having stomach problems that day and I didn't feel well. There's a bunch of things I'm going to filter out, and I'm just going to remember what's important, maybe the content of the conversation. So if you think about, okay, well, what if I were to film now that conversation, reenact the conversation, right? Do I need to include the background music? Do I need to include the conversation at the table next door? Do I need to include what happened right before and right after? No, right? I need to filter all of that out and just include the relevant information. So that's why oftentimes reenactment strategies, right? When you're reenacting something that you want to tell the story of something that happened in the past, but you just want to tell the relevant information. Sometimes minimalist reenactments are the way to go. Animation, crude kind of drawings. There's even people that will use puppets or mannequins, to reenact things in the past. Or even if you're filming a reenactment, sometimes you want to just make it simple. You don't want people thinking about what the background music was in the cafe. You don't want them distracted by the conversation in the table next door. You don't want any of that kind of stuff, right? You want what's relevant to the story that you're telling. Here's something that happened in the past that's relevant to what I'm trying to tell right now. And so I'm giving you only that information. It's the same way you think about it when you tell a story, right? When I tell you about my day yesterday, I'm only going to include the relevant information, right? So there's a real sense that relevance realization is a big part of what is true. Okay. So there's a lot there. I'm gonna give you guys a couple. I'm gonna come at this at a slightly different angle now. Oh, my controls here. There we go. All right. Okay. So here's a Calvin and Hobbes. I love Calvin and Hobbes comic. Calvin says to Hobbes, "This is what I like about photography. People think cameras always tell the truth. They think the camera is a dispassionate machine that records only facts. Records only facts. But really, cameras lie all the time. Select the facts, and you manipulate the truth." Isn't that interesting? That's what some of those filmmakers were saying in that clip that we watched. For example, I've cleared off this corner of my bed. Take a picture of me here, but crop out all the mess around me so it looks like I keep my room tidy. And then Hobbes says, "Is this even legal?" And then Calvin says, "Wait, let me comb my hair and put on a tie on." So the camera can lie by not showing something. There is a sense that all photography is a lie, right? Because you can't show everything. You can't show what's behind the camera. You can't show what's to this side of the camera or this side of the camera. So is photography truth? Maybe, in some sense, but it's also almost always a lie as well. And so now the ethical question is not so much, is it factual, right? Because a fact can be a lie, right? Calvin just said it, right? The frame, the fact of him sitting on his bed, the capturing of that fact, of that instant of him sitting on the bed with his hair combed, is done with the intent to deceive. And what's the intent to deceive? The fact that his room is a mess. It's presenting a fact for the purposes of deception, right? So facts are not normative, right? They are not neutral. They are manipulated in the hands of whoever is directing all of this. Okay, so one thing about the history of painting is relevant here. As portraiture, look, when the invention of the camera in the 1800s, as portraiture gave way to photography in depicting reality, painters sought a new identity in depicting impressionistic versions of reality. So if you take a look at that portrait of George Washington here, right? So you think of the role of the painter at a certain point was to represent what someone looked like for posterity or for someone who couldn't see them in person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So representing reality as it appears to the human eye was important, right? And then, of course, I can't remember who it was, the famous, I think he was an English king or something, wanted the painter to paint him warts and all. Remember that, warts and all? I want you to paint me warts and all. And that has become a phrase now, because he said, well, you're not going to take out my flaws, right? This is going to be real, right? And so there was a real sort of honor in the ability of the painter to represent reality that way. Well, when photography became, portrait photography became the way to do it, using a lens and using photosensitive materials and light, it sort of said, well, we're taking out one level of interpretation, namely the eye of the painter, and it's going to the camera. It's a mechanical thing. And so portraiture became a displacing in a lot of ways the profession of the painter, the portrait painter, right? So the rise of impressionism in painting, like this Claude Monet, and of course you've seen paintings from this period, where it's more depicting a mood. It's depicting something subjective, because the painter is saying, well, here's something that I have that dispassionate machine, the camera, does not have, right? So that was kind of behind that. But if you think about it, if you think about what Errol Morris said and what Werner Herzog said and some of these other filmmakers said, that interpretive aspect is there with the camera as well. It's not just with painting, right? So impressionistic photography, of course, certainly exists, right? And we are aware of the fact that just like the painter, the photographer is putting some of themselves into what they're doing. Okay, so capital T versus little t truth, particulars and universals. That's kind of what we're talking about here. So what's the interplay between these things? So you might think of it this way. Down here on the ground, you've got facts, lowercase t truths. But like Werner Herzog said, there's thousands, there's millions, there's cajillions of them, right? It's not that we don't have any facts at our disposal. It's that we have too many to pay attention to. Think of when I'm in the cafe and I'm trying to listen to what you're saying, and I'm hearing the radio, and I'm hearing the people next door, and I'm hearing the order number 7 is up, whatever, right? I need to tune all that out and focus on what's relevant to me. Okay. And so what is relevant to me in that conversation, or in a documentary film, or in a painting, right? So you can think of it this way, like you're down here and you're taking a fact and you're selecting that fact. You're selecting it for a certain purpose. Why? Because maybe it's an example of some higher truth that you're trying to say. Maybe it is an anecdote that represents something higher. So then you're going to get up to the stratosphere, and you're going to get up to the symbolic. You're going to get up to the archetypal. You're going to get up to the 30,000-foot view, and you're going to get up to what Werner Herzog calls ecstatic truth. Okay, so that's kind of the way it happens. Now, I'm primarily interested in this because I'm interested in exploring what the artistic practice is with respect to relevance realization and selecting facts that can somehow rise up into the expression of a higher truth. That's what Werner Herzog is talking about when he talks about ecstatic truth. A very famous and controversial statement that he made, that cinema verite, which is truth, is devoid of verite if it only has facts. It needs ecstatic truth. All right? And that's been so confusing for so many of my friends. What does he mean by that? This is, I think, what he's trying to get at. All right, so I'm going to show you a clip here of Ira Glass. Ira Glass is a radio host for NPR, and he does This American Life, which is a very, very interesting and fun and quirky journalistic show where he finds ordinary people, does audio interviews of them, and creates these stories. And here he's talking about how he goes from an anecdote, which again is that fact on the ground, and trying to find how it connects up to the symbolic or the emblematic, or in the best cases, to the archetypal.
I mean, one of the things I think is really important if you're making stories for television or radio is that you understand the building blocks of the stories. And there are different ways to think about this. One of the things you don't want to do is you don't want to think about it the way that you learned in high school, which is in high school we're all taught that the way that you write is that there's like a topic sentence and then there's like the facts which fill out the argument. In broadcasting, it's completely different. In broadcasting, I think you have two basic building blocks, and they're very powerful, and you can use them as you will. And one is the anecdote. And an anecdote is literally just a sequence of actions. If you think of it as just like, what is a story in its purest form? A story in its purest form is somebody saying, this happened, and that led to this next thing, and that led to this next thing, and that led to this next thing, like one thing following another. And some of the things in the sequence can be, and that made me think of this, and then I said this. Like there could be thoughts and ideas as part of it, but like one is leading to the next, leading to the next. And the power of the anecdote is so great that no matter how, in a way, like no matter how boring the material is, if it's in a story form where there's an anecdote happening, and then he said this to me, and then I went here, and then I came downstairs, and I thought, like, what the hell? Like, it has a momentum in and of itself that no matter how boring the facts are, like I'm trying to think like okay, there's, you know, if you try to think like the most boring possible story, okay, there's a guy, and he wakes up, and he's lying there in bed, and the house is very, very quiet, just unearthly quiet. And so he sits up, and he puts his feet on the floor, and he walks to the door of his bedroom, and again, just very, very quiet. Walks down the stairs, looks around, just unusually quiet. Now, like this is like what I'm telling you is the most boring possible fact pattern, and yet there's suspense in it. It feels like something's going to happen. And the reason why is because literally it's a sequence of events. Like this guy is doing this thing, he's moving from space to space. You can feel through its form that when you have one thing leading to the next, leading to the next, you can feel inherently that you're on a train that has a destination and that he's going to find something. And so one of the most powerful things you have to figure out is, like, do you just start with the action, or should you just start with the action? In general, you want to start with the action, or you often do. So that's one of your building blocks. The other thing that little anecdote has is that it's raising a question from the beginning. And that's the other thing that you want, is you want bait. You want to constantly be raising questions. So in that little story, the bait is that the house is very quiet. And so the question hanging in the air is why? And it's implied that any question you raise, you're going to answer. And so again, that's another thing you want to manipulate. You want to be constantly raising questions and answering them from the beginning of the story. And that the whole shape of a story is that you're throwing out questions to keep people watching or listening, and then answering them along the way. Okay, so you have the building block, which is like the actual sequence of actions, the anecdote part of it. This thing happened, and then this thing, and then this thing. That's one building block. Then the other big building block, your other tool, is that you have a moment of reflection. And by that I mean, at some point, somebody's got to say, here's why the hell you're listening to this story. Like, here's the point of the story. Here's the bigger something that we're driving at. Here's why I'm wasting your time with all this. And one of the things that's very, very unfortunate for people who are launching into the kinds of jobs that all the people who are making video pods are launching into, one of the things that's so very sad, and it's like the bane of my existence, and it's the bane of anybody's existence who does this kind of work, is that often, you have the two parts of this, the two parts of the structure. You've got the anecdote and you've got the moment of reflection. And often you'll have an anecdote which just kills. It's just so interesting. Like, this thing happens and it leads to the next and it leads to the next, and it's so surprising, and so many things happen. You meet these great characters and it means absolutely nothing. Like, it's just completely predictable. It doesn't tell you anything new. And so that's one huge problem. And then the other huge problem is you got a kind of boring set of facts, or boring story, right? That actually, like, somebody actually has something kind of interesting to say about it. And so actually, I think a lot of us, when we're beginning, we get caught in the problem of, we know we've got something here. We know that there's something here that's kind of compelling, but it just doesn't seem to be coming together. And often it's your job to be kind of ruthless and to understand that either you don't have a sequence of actions, you don't have the story part that works, or you don't have a moment of reflection that works. And you're going to need both. And in a good story, you're going to flip back and forth between the two. Like, there'll be a little bit of action, and then someone will say something about it, and there'll be a little more action, and someone will say something. And that's really like a lot of the trick of the whole thing, is to have the perseverance that if you've got an interesting anecdote, that you also can end up with an interesting moment of reflection that will support it. And then the two together, interwoven in 3 minutes or 6 minutes or however long your story is, will make something that's larger than the sum of its parts.
Wow. He's so good. I just, yeah, he's so good. um, so, all right. Okay, so what were the elements that he mentioned there? All right, he's talking about the anecdote, which is there on the ground. Okay, and what is it that it needs to be paired with? A moment of reflection. What is the moment of reflection? Like he said, why the hell are you listening to this? Why the hell are you watching this? Right? The why question. Why? Right? So the anecdotes can be interesting, or they might seem like they're interesting, or they might seem visceral, or might seem compelling, but they need to be paired, he says, paired with a moment of reflection. The moment of reflection is up here. That's the archetypal. That's the symbolic. That's ecstatic truth. That's the 30,000-foot view. And in other interviews that he gives elsewhere about his process, he talks about this idea that in an interview, he's actually thinking about that moment of reflection while he's gathering his anecdotes. So he's gathering the anecdotes and he's thinking, where does this connect up to this larger point or this larger meaning? And oftentimes, he'll just simply ask whoever he's interviewing, well, what do you think that means? What do you think this anecdote that you're telling me, what do you think it means? And have you ever noticed, this is really, really interesting. Let's say you go to a party, all right, and there's somebody there who tells a great anecdote, right? They really tell a great anecdote. And you're listening and you're with them. You're with them, right? And then it ends. And then well, what's the point? What happened, right? And nothing. That's just the story that I wanted to tell you. There's no point to it. There's no end to it. There's, you know that feeling that you get. There's always bless his heart, but a person that I know that just always is a conversation killer. I'm sure you have the same type of people. And you'll notice the game of the conversation where things are ping-ponging around a certain theme, right? So that's this, right? We're each exchanging stories down here because we're all trying to get up here, okay? And then there's that one person who wants to jump in, and then they tell theirs, and it doesn't connect up, right? It doesn't connect up to the big theme that we're going through, right? And or maybe in their mind they think it does, but they didn't make the connection for you, and everyone else goes what? And it like it's like a record scratch. It causes the conversation to just grind to a stop, right? Very interesting phenomenon. I was thinking about this in terms of I was at work the other day and somebody had their house broken into, right? So they had an anecdote. There's the anecdote. My house was broken into, right? And all of us, of course, were riveted. What happened? Did you have an alarm? Was it at night? Were you afraid? Were you in danger? This, right? And then he finished his story, right? And then the ping ponging started, the ping pong game, right? And then this person said, when my car was broken into, I parked it over here, and then my catalytic converter got stolen off of it, or whatever, And then the next person, and then I wanted to get in too. I was like, oh, I want to tell the story about when my car was broken into. And I was thinking to myself, why am I doing this? Why do I want to get my anecdote in there? And I think, this is my theory, I think it's because the connecting up to the higher part is something very basic that we're all concerned with, which is how do I avoid getting my stuff stolen like you did, right? So there's a very kind of visceral, basic sense of we are collecting together a body of knowledge consisting of stories, consisting of anecdotes that we're all going to compare so that we can build up a bulwark against theft as a community, right? So I don't know if you remember, like there was some talk about self-driving cars maybe a couple years ago, and people were wondering, well, won't self-driving cars cause more accidents than cars driven by people, right? And the argument was that no, because a network of self-driving cars instantly updates, right? So let's say a car is driving and they make a right-hand turn in front of a bus because the cameras on the car are not recognizing it as a bus, and someone dies, right? And it's a tragedy, okay? That would make everyone say, well, see what happens when machines drive the cars. But then the engineer person says, oh no, au contraire. That one incident will never be repeated again because that data is now collected and that data is disseminated to the entire AI network or whatever kind of network it is that runs these self-driving cars, right? So the argument was that this network is more efficient than human beings because a human being can make the same mistake twice. Two different human beings can make the same mistake, whereas two different machines cannot because their brains are networked together, let's say. But wasn't that exactly what I was doing with my friends when we were exchanging stories about theft? Weren't we updating our collective distributed cognition, right? All of us together were engaged, and that's why we're so engaged in it, I think, is because, okay, let's figure this out. Let's find out how we can stop ourselves from getting taken advantage of, how we can stop people from breaking into our houses or breaking into our cars, right? How we can maintain a sense of order and justice, right? Okay, so there you've got some bigger names there: order, justice, right? And the anecdotes are all funneling in towards this larger purpose, right? Okay, so that I think is part of what is going on when Ira Glass is talking about the anecdote, and the meaning of the anecdote has to connect up to something higher. Okay, so there's a sense that what you're doing when you're going out there to create something, whether that's a documentary film or, like I say, a painting or photograph or even a journalistic story, whatever it is, you're engaging in what Werner Herzog calls filmmaking as a journey on foot. You're going out and you're actually looking for certain facts, right? You're looking for ones that are relevant to whatever it is, the point that you're trying to make. And did you notice how the filmmakers in that clip that I showed earlier said that there's two sides to this, because it's appropriate, I think, that you look, right? It is appropriate that when we're all exchanging stories about how someone got broken into, or has that ever happened to you in the past, it's important to choose the story that is relevant to what we're talking about, to the topic of conversation, right? That's like my friend in the party who's always the conversation killer, doesn't choose his anecdotes very well. And so then it kills the conversation, because then everybody says, well, we were all telling stories about how we all got our car broken into, and you just told a story about how you ate the wrong thing for dinner last night or something, right? Something not relevant to what we're talking about, not relevant to the game, the conversation game that we are playing. So it's important. It is right. It is appropriate to choose the facts based on relevance. Okay. However, you can also manipulate. So it depends on your motivation. It depends on what you're trying to do. It depends on if you're trying to do something good or if you're trying to do something bad. And so that's why, what's the difference between when Werner Herzog has little Dieter opening and closing the door as in an anecdote, as a false reenactment of a true state of psychological state that his subject has, and what they mentioned Michael Moore, who is using his films as a political polemic, right? What's the difference between those two things? Okay, so I'm not going to necessarily answer that question. I'm going to say that my personal sense is that you have to have, when you engage in an artistic practice, a moral code of your own, a certain set of goals and motivations that, one, for example, with me, is that I try to say to myself that anyone that's going to be in one of my films ought to be, as to the best of my ability, better off after the film is made than before. Something simple like that. And I'm going to be consciously choosing, a better motive for making my film, as opposed to exploitation. Because it is very easy to exploit. It is very possible to exploit. But that doesn't mean that you still don't choose facts. It doesn't mean that you still don't manipulate, right? It's just, what's the end of your manipulation? What's the purpose of your manipulation? Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about how an anecdote down here, a truth, a fact, lowercase t, truth, fact, down here can connect up to something more emblematic. One work that I really recommend it's actually two works here, is The Catholic Imagination by Andrew Greeley, and then After Image by Richard A. Blake. In The Catholic Imagination, there's this idea that you don't have to necessarily believe in Catholicism consciously in order for it to influence you. You can have a Catholic imagination, or you can have a Protestant imagination. And then this book over here, After Image, talks about, let's see, 5 filmmakers: Martin Scorsese, Alfred Hitchcock, Frank Capra, Ford, Coppola, and De Palma. They all are nominally or actively or lapsed Catholics, right? But they all have certain similar themes in their movies that are what he argues to be Catholic themes. Where does that come from? It comes from the imagination, right? So there's some sense that the connecting up, let me go back to that. To here, okay. There's some sense that the way that you connect up those lowercase t truths, those on the ground facts, up to the archetypal and ecstatic truth has something to do with what you might call religious imagination or spiritual imagination, right? So your ability to see that this represents that, your ability to interact with and connect with the symbolic, in a lot of ways depends on your ability for your imagination to be shaped by spiritual practice or religious culture or upbringing, right? And the evidence of that is that these Catholic filmmakers seem to have a Catholic imagination. And you could argue that these Protestant filmmakers like Ingmar Bergman happen to have a Protestant imagination, or you could say Orthodox filmmakers like Tarkovsky, Russian Orthodox filmmaker, has a Orthodox imagination, that there's certain influences. And he uses the phrase after image as this kind of idea that when, if you're in the dark in the bathroom and a flash goes off, you're going to have the lingering image, because of your persistence of vision in your eye, of that image after the light's already gone. If you flash somebody in, with a camera flash, that image will linger in your eye. So even if you don't consciously believe it, right, you still have an after image, right? That's kind of the example. Okay. And so reality is structured in such a way that it is fractal, right? That these anecdotes on the ground, they're not just random, that there is some sense that it does connect up to the emblematic, to the archetypal, to the symbolic, right? And so there's a sense that the artist has this certain ability, this certain imaginative quality to be able to see those anecdotes and see that they connect up, right? That's the case that I kind of want to make to you today. The symbolic. all of these images, the tree, the raven, water, desert, mountains, these things, you'll find that in movies, in even documentaries, that the symbolic is very present, even if it's a non-fiction film. That's what's very, very interesting about this, is that non-fiction can be symbolic. And, when I tell people that, they think, well, what are you talking about? I can understand how a fiction film can put a bunch of symbols in, right? It was, I think, Robert McKee. Robert McKee in Story, he talks about if you're a screenwriter, you can put in an image system, internal or external image system. What he means by that is that you can say, okay, in my screenplay, water is going to represent this, or earth is going to represent this. You could say, oftentimes earth will represent mortality, something like that. Or mountains are going to represent higher wisdom, whatever it is. And you can build that into your screenplay. And he kind of says that that's a way to kind of improve the screenplay for your movie. But he talks about you can have an internal image system where you decide what everything's going to represent, but you can also borrow symbols from the wider culture to be your image system. And I would want to say that he's right about that, but the amount of borrowing is probably more than he realized, right? So if you're choosing water as a symbol in your screenplay, it means a lot more probably than just what the significance within your story you're trying to give it, or if you use a mountain in your story, it's going to mean a lot more than what you think it is. It's going to really extend out beyond, in terms of its meaning and significance, beyond your movie, right? Okay, so this is probably how I look to you right now. I'm trying to explain all these obscure things to you. All right, I'm going to give you an example now of a documentary that is choosing facts, choosing anecdotes, choosing stories in order to make a larger religious, spiritual, profound, ecstatic truth type of a point. Okay. This is a movie called Genesis 2.0. It was at Sundance, I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and it is still, to this day, one of the most well-done documentaries that I think I've ever seen. I'm going to show you the trailer, and then we can discuss.
Древний человек сотни тысяч лет жил вместе с мамонтом.
For the Industrial Revolution with energy, it was the machine. For us, it's the cell. It's going to change everything.
The hunters search for tusks. Each one of them desperately hopes to find the white gold.
Кровоточащий мамонт.
World-famous molecular engineer and geneticist George Church. He wants to bring a woolly mammoth back to life, out of a petri dish.
Hopefully, mammoth.
Baby mammoth.
Oh la la, excellent. It's invaluable. God's word is still imperfect. But if we work together, we can make God perfect.
Ну, некоторые вот старики особенно говорили, что типа даже землю копать нельзя.
Находить мамонта считалось Это очень плохо.
Is that becoming an issue? The ethical considerations for something like that seems very sensitive.
Человеческая натура такая, что надо, больше. В будущем посмотрим, что получится, думает человек.
Okay. Wow. The, this film is so profound. It always gets me. So basically, you've got two anecdotes, two on the ground storylines, and they're intercut with each other. Okay. On the one hand, you've got these guys. You've got these hunters that are looking for the white gold. What they are is they're looking for these. Oh, and then you've got these guys. So these are the geneticists. These are the people that are looking for a different kind of gold, like a different kind of something. These guys are looking for mammoth tusks, and it's way up north, almost to the North Pole, about as far north as you can go. Super dangerous. And each one of them thinks, if I can just find the perfect woolly mammoth tusk, all of my problems are gonna be solved. So they talk about how they've got families back home, how they just hope that someday they'll be able to afford this, or they'll be able to provide for their family. And they hate the fact that they got to be out in the cold and they got to be away from their family for 6 months at a time. But they hope that they're going to find this elusive white gold, and then all of their problems are going to be over, right? So there's this sense of trying to find something, trying to accomplish something that's going to be the answer to everything, right? Okay. And then you have, let's see, you've got these scientists, okay? And they're looking for another kind of gold, right? They want to clone the woolly mammoth, right? So these guys want to find the old tusks, and these guys want to clone the woolly mammoth. And they think that there's this amazing accomplishment that can be had with science and genetic technology, right? And this guy's talking about how God's work is imperfect and how we can use science to make God perfect, right? And then there's this moment where on the tour, this is where they clone your dog. So if you lost your dog and you loved your dog, you can go to this place. I think it's in South Korea, and they will clone your dog for you and give you a brand new one, right? So there's a real sense of playing God. Okay, now in this clip here, she's just explained that with the technology of genetic manipulation, whatever it is, that you could, she says, eliminate autism, right? But what she means is you can detect if someone's going to be born with autism, and you can get rid of them before they're born, and eventually the human society will be without people that have autism, right? And that one questioner was saying, well, aren't there some ethical implications to that, right? That what you're doing, aren't you playing God in some sense, right? So the juxtaposition of the two storylines implies that they're both going to the same end. Now, what happens to our lovable travelers seeking the white gold? I'm going to spoil it, but it doesn't go well for them. So it doesn't go well for those hunters, the white gold seekers. There's a sense that you have two parallel Tower of Babel stories, right? That's the larger picture. That when you're trying to find that magic elixir that's going to solve all your problems, you are going to be building this Tower of Babel, and it's not going to work out, right? The promise of everybody that came to California in the 1800s looking for gold, not very many of them became rich, right? The promise of Las Vegas, gambling, you probably are going to lose your money, but that idea in your mind that maybe I'll be the one, or the lottery, right? All of these different things that we just think, well, maybe this will be the answer to everything. Maybe this will solve all of my problems, right? So the biogeneticists are trying to do that on the genetic level, and the implication from the filmmakers is, isn't that going to end up the same way the white gold seekers end up, where they finally get their cargo across the sea, and then the market has shifted, and they get barely enough to survive. They don't get rich, and they're going to have to go back next year, right? This whole idea of escaping the cycle through this elusive, it's kind of the same thing like someone going to Vegas and saying, well, this time I'm probably going to win enough that I can retire. This time, things will be different, right? This idea that there's a magic fix to your life out there, right? A magic fix to all of our problems. Okay, so that's I think one example of someone attempting to I know it's getting a little abstract. Okay, I'm going to give you one. Well, this might be another example. Okay, maybe it's not a Tower of Babel. Maybe you might think of it as an Icarus story, right? They're trying to fly too close to the sun. They're hoping that they can fly higher. The geneticists can fly higher, and they're going to solve all of our problems. But isn't that going to be just set us up for your wings to melt, and you're going to fall back to Earth? Okay. So that's one example. I hope that made sense of how I think you can connect something on the ground up to something symbolic, right? Now here's another one that's very interesting, I think. So this is Valerie Taylor. Valerie Taylor was in a documentary from Sundance last year called "Playing with Sharks," right? And she was the original film. She filmed, her and her husband were Australian divers, and they filmed the great white shark footage for the original Jaws in the 70s. And she was a very, very famous diver. Okay. And there's this sense, okay, remember Jaws? Remember why was Jaws so famous? Why did it do so well? Why did it make so much money? One of the reasons was because it was depicting Leviathan, right? It was depicting this symbolic element, right? The sea creature, Moby Dick, Pinocchio, and the Jonah and the whale. This idea of this chaos monster that comes from the deep, right? And if you think about the shark in Jaws, that shark had no higher cognitive abilities. It just wanted to eat. It just wanted to destroy the community, right? It was not real in some sense. Like, it didn't have the motivations of a normal shark or a normal creature. It's an element of a nightmare. Have you ever noticed, like, when you have a nightmare, whoever the villain is in your nightmare doesn't follow the normal laws of nature necessarily, right? It's not predictable. It's not something that you can understand. That's why it's scary to us, right? So that's what Jaws did. Okay, and then she was a part of that. She was part of constructing this mythos around this Jaws. So if you think about the image system that Robert McKee talked about, right, where you can put a symbol in your movie, in your screenplay, right, that's going to cause your screenplay to have universal appeal. If you're using a universal symbol, it's going to have universal appeal. And that's what happened with Jaws. And everyone was completely blown away by this because the summer blockbuster was invented, right? And then after that, of course, Joseph Campbell came along with George Lucas came along using the Hero with 1,000 Faces from Joseph Campbell to make Star Wars, another sort of symbolic a piece that did very well monetarily, right? So there's this real sense that you can use these symbols. Okay. Now let's go back to Valerie Taylor. So Valerie Taylor was a part of creating this mythos about sharks, but she had a change of heart because what happened? Everybody after the movie Jaws came out started to get inspired by that symbol, and what did they do? They went out into the ocean and they started killing sharks. They started hunting endangered species. Okay. And she didn't like that, right? She didn't think that that was a good idea.
Has the potential to be a great adventure. I would slide into the water, into another world.
Back in the 50s, there was so much marine life, you learned how to hunt. The first lady spearfishing championships, there were 7 women. There was about 700 men, and I was very good at it.
The attitude was take what you want and never make a difference. Just kill, kill, kill. I never killed one shark. I wish I hadn't. From now on, I'm shooting them with my camera. Very little was known around the world about sharks in those days. You can watch it from the boat all you want, but you still haven't seen it underwater in action. We realised a shark can learn faster than you can teach a dog.
Have we reason to be afraid of them? I don't think that a shark swims around saying, "Ha, there's a human, I must swim up and eat him." They don't think like that.
I decided to prove that sharks were not out to get us.
Sharks are fighting to survive. They want to live, just as you or I want to live.
Once I get my teeth stuck into an idea, I don't let go.
It's like any animal, once you get to know it and understand it, you have a different attitude altogether.
I will probably be diving when I'm in a wheelchair. Nature made the perfect animal. Here's to the sharks. See how he smiles?
See how he smiles. Very interesting. So,
Every job.
all right. So you might think, right, that this documentary is pushing back against the symbol that was used in Jaws, right? They're saying this universal symbol that is something from your nightmares, when taken literally, caused the death of all these innocent creatures, right? And caused perhaps the extinction of some creatures. And so you can't do that. You can't mythologize. You need to see these sharks as ordinary creatures, not mythological, symbols, right? And I was thinking about that, and then I realized, you know what? It's not that the filmmakers of this movie were anti-mythological. They were just operating under a different archetype, right? Beauty and the Beast, right? She's beauty and the shark is the beast, right? Everyone else sees a beast, but she's able to humanize it, right? She's talking about a shark is just as intelligent as a dog. You know, a dog is a pet, right? And she's talking about how the shark smiles, right? And there's this moment in the film where she's holding like a fish, and the great white shark, all of its teeth, bites down, and she pats it on the nose. So she's humanizing the shark. She's turning a beast, something that you would be afraid of, something uncivilized, something all lower instincts, something that only eats, into something else, right? Not a human, but at least a domesticated animal of some kind, right? So this movie as well, even the documentary, you know, it's not the case that it was not using the symbolic, right? They still found a way to tell the story. I don't know if they did it consciously. In fact, I think they probably didn't do it consciously, but they found a way to make this story about Beauty and the Beast, right? Instead of about Leviathan. Jaws was about Leviathan, and this is about Beauty and the Beast. And there's a sense, I think, that we as human communities need both stories. We need stories about Leviathan. We need stories also about Beauty and the Beast, right? They are relevant maybe in different situations. You could talk about how Leviathan represents that which we don't know, that which we fear, that which is beyond our realm of the familiar and the safe, and how to deal with that. And that's what the movie Jaws is about. And then we could also talk about how we need to go out and find that which we think is threatening. And when you learn about it, it is no longer scary. It is no longer a beast. It becomes domesticated. It becomes more human. It becomes more predictable, right? What's the difference between a dog that is tame and domesticated and a wild animal? Well, part of it is its predictability. And the more you learn about something, the more you can predict its behavior, and the less you have to be afraid of it, right? You know that the shark isn't going to come up and eat your whole boat like it does in Jaws, but it's still a dangerous animal, right? But in learning about it, that was the task that she engaged in, going out to learn about these creatures. Now they're not Leviathan anymore. Now it's Beauty and the Beast. So yeah, those are two examples of how I'm thinking about this, right? This is new material. This is material that I haven't taught in a class yet. And it's me just trying to take some of this symbolic, some of these thinking about the symbolic and how it relates to this specific art form that I'm connected to. So I hope you guys, I hope that made sense. I hope maybe there's some moments in there that of insight for you. And I'm going to keep going with this stuff. Keep trying to dig deeper and kind of connect up and figure out these things. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.